The Young and the Restless spoilers Monday full September 1-0-5. Nikki chose her moment with the precision of a woman who had survived both scandal and success and learned how to fold each into the shape of authority. Inviting Claire to a quiet lunch away from the knowing eyes at Newman and the buzzing speculation that had followed her since Kyle confessed the kiss he'd stopped before it turned into a catastrophe. She didn't sweep the recent pain under the rug, didn't offer perfumed platitudes about resilience. She simply said she could see the work Claire was doing and wanted to make that work official, to put structure around the effort and purpose around the second chance. And the offer came in the form of a new position that was neither a consolation prize nor a ceremonial ribbon and associate director role attached to a portfolio of special initiatives that bridged Newman's philanthropic arm and its brand stewardship, the kind of assignment that would require judgment, steadiness, and a feel for people. Nikki framed it as confidence rather than charity, a vote in favor of what Claire had shown rather than a pardon for what she once was. But even as the room softened with the grandmother's pride and a mentor's belief, Claire heard a different echo in her mind. A memory of Victoria declining promotions until she had evidence not of competence, because she had that, but of worthiness to herself, a private threshold that could not be faked. And the conflict sat inside Claire, like two magnets pulling opposite directions. Acceptance would set a stake in the ground and tell Genoa City she had arrived on merit, while deferral would honor the quiet promise she'd made in the mirror that she would never again leap forward simply because a powerful hand beckoned. She thanked Nikki. She meant it. And she asked for time, not to negotiate perks or titles, but to chart what success would look like if she said yes. And Nikki, a woman who understood long arcs, nodded, told her that power used with patience had a longer half-life, and promised the door would remain open without pressure. Yet the very existence of that door changed the weather around Claire as rumors congealed into a story about a promotion that might be nepotism or might be redemption, depending on who you asked at the bar that night, while the city's attention drifted to whether Claire would pull a Victoria and delay the crown until she could wear it without wobbling. The other half of the storied relationship that had drawn the blood and the headlines was, crossing its own point of no return, Kyle, who had watched his mother slap the woman he loved and heard his own voice break open into a howl he didn't recognize, understood that an apology was necessary but insufficient, that flowers and promises would sound like wallpaper over a damaged wall. So he did something he rarely does. He picked the ugliest possible truths and put them on the table. First with Claire in a room without phones where accountability wasn't performance. Then with Nikki and Jack a day later, when the ripple would be felt beyond romance. To Claire he said the words in one breath, I kissed Audra. I stopped. I told you. But the choice to start was mine, and I won't pretend it was a lapse without context. And then he did the thing that actually mattered. He redesigned the context, severing the architecture that let temptation live in his calendar. Within 72 hours, he had tendered a leave of absence from the collaboration that kept him inside Audra's orbit, notified legal that he wanted a formal conflict screen blocking him from any project that touched her accounts, transferred to junior staffers to protect them from the fallout so the building would not turn his mistake into their career bruise, and sent Audra a short, lawyer-cleared message that closed every personal door. He invited a third-party Simeon Clare could choose to monitor communications for the next 3 months so the promise would be measurable, not mystical. And when Claire chose Amanda Sinclair, he didn't flinch. He signed the paper. The choice of Amanda was not accidental. Fans had been whispering about her return. But when she stepped off the elevator, with a portfolio under one arm and a stare that told the whole floor she had no interest in ceremony, it became clear this wasn't a nostalgia tour. This was a mission. Amanda's new brief married her surgical legal mind to a human problem set, build ethics firewalls where loyalties blurred, define consent and boundaries where memory and desire like to pretend the rules go fuzzy, and insulate Newman's next generation Claire included from the predatory pageantry that often masquerades as networking in Genoa City. She took it personally without becoming personal, a posture that made even the cockiest executives recalibrate. Amanda began with interviews rather than edicts, mapping the corridors where Audra's access had become an accelerant happy hour debriefs that stretched to midnight, text threads that braided business and flirtation, handshake deals that were really leveraged trades, and she wrote a quiet policy that was less a hammer than a latticework. One of its provisions, crafted with Claire's explicit request, allowed any partner in a cross-company romance to trigger a cooling-off period that froze proximity without freezing opportunity. A way to choose space without choosing sides. Kyle invoked it, publicly and without spin. And the announcement landed with a shockwave because men in positions like his usually prefer shadows and gray zones, and this was a bright line. The gesture did not absolve him, and Claire did not pretend it did, but it flipped the gravity of the story, no longer a question of whether she could trust his words. It became a question of whether she could trust a system being rebuilt to make the better choice the easier one. And in that shift her body unclenched, not because the pain was gone, but because she could imagine not living inside it every day. Still, trust is not a referendum. It's a practice. Claire set her own conditions with a clarity that made Kyle love her more and fear losing her in the same breath. 6 weeks without private contact with Audra of any kind. Couples therapy with a counselor, not paid by any abbot. A commitment to stop allowing Diane's guilt to script their boundaries, and a moratorium on engagement plans until after the 6-week mark. Not as punishment, but as an experiment in slowness. Kyle agreed to each to the letter, and then did something extreme in a different register. He moved out of the Abbott house into a small furnished place near the river, a symbolic exile from the architecture that turned sons into loyalists and lovers into liabilities. He didn't pre-announce it to make a point. He simply texted Claire the address in case she needed him in the night, and sent Jack a note that said he would be back on Sundays for dinner when he could be a son without making Claire pay the tax for it. Nikki, watching the pieces rearrange themselves with the patience of a chess player who has seen a dozen endgames, reached for the lever she knew best. She protected Claire's dignity in public while refusing to smother her agency in private. At a donor event that would have been awkward in another timeline, she took the microphone and, without preamble or pageant, spoke about merit, about how redemption in this town rings hollow unless the redeemed are allowed to do hard work in daylight. And then she did something even braver for a Newman matriarch. She said not yet, promising that the role offered to Claire had a start date written in pencil, because leadership worth having starts with the person who can say, "I'm not quite ready, give me a target, give me a standard, and I'll meet it." And the room, conditioned to perfume and softness, went still at the sound of a matriarch validating delay as a form of strength. Within hours, the Whisper Network had a new line. Maybe the promotion wasn't a cushion for a scandal at Almabe, it was the scaffolding for an ascent that wouldn't collapse at the first gust of gossip. Nikki's framing shielded Claire from the lazy takes, and in a complication Nikki surely anticipated of, Audra fewer rhetorical knives to throw. Because nepotism is a louder word when there's a ribbon cutting and a press release, and far quieter when the putative beneficiary chooses metrics before perks. Audra, of course, did not retreat. She tried a different tack, floating the story in back channels that Kyle's kiss had been more predatory than penitent, testing whether the city would prefer that scandal to the more boring truth of blurred lines and arrested impulse. But Amanda met that move 2 steps ahead, not with counter-gossip, but with receipts, time-stamps, access logs, travel calendars, triangulations that made the innuendo wilt, and thin in a flourish that felt less theatrical than diagnostics discovered a thin ribbon of correspondence linking Audra's late-night strategy calls to an intermediary shelf. Corporation that had recently been observed circling Marchetti's IP like a shark. Tucker's name did not appear, and Amanda did not overreach. She simply placed the chain on the table and labeled it what it was, a risk. The room understood the word's meaning in corporate dialectrics is the opposite of leverage and the prelude to exits end while no one accused anyone of anything on paper. The chilling effect was immediate. Meetings moved to daylight, flirtation reverted to silence, and for the first time in months, Claire could walk into an office without bracing for a rumor to skid across the polished floor and tangle around her ankles. Meanwhile, Jack tried to conjure peace inside a house whose rooms had perfect memory for conflict, nudging Diane toward a real apology that acknowledged the slap as an act of control rather than a flare of concern. But Diane only managed half steps, visible remorse, yes, and a sincerity that wasn't counterfeit, but still laced with the terrified insistence that she had been trying to protect her son from the very heartache he was navigating now. It was Claire, not Kyle, who cut through that knot by refusing to convert Diane's fear into her own shame again. She chose distance over feuds, boundaries over blow-ups, sending a single text message through Jack that made the terms plain. I don't need a ceremony. I need quiet. If Diane can offer that, time can sand the sharpness down. If she can't, we will keep the doors closed. And because Jack knows the geometry of damage, he sat with Diane until she understood that quiet is not exile. It is the only climate in which trust grows back. In private, Kyle grieved what he was losing and what he might never get back: a mother's easy embrace, a family calendar that didn't have fault lines drawn through every Sunday, but he did not weaponize that grief against Claire. And if there is an early miracle in this story, it is that choice to absorb the cost without cashing it out at the counter of the person you love. By the third week, the new pattern had settled into muscle memory. Kyle's evenings had fewer emails and more silences that weren't empty. Claire's mornings began with runs that returned her to a body she trusted. Nikki's team finalized a draft of the role that read less like a coronation and more like a charter: measurable outcomes tied to mentorship pipelines and community partnerships that would translate redemption into deliverables. And Amanda, having done the investigative work, pivoted to architecture, helping HR and legal turn a handful of bespoke fixes into a framework anyone could use. A manual for how to de-escalate without self-erasure. She did it with the same cool steadiness she once brought to cases that cut deeper than contracts. And even those who remembered the complicated history she shared with this town felt something like relief watching her build rather than burn. On a Thursday that didn't seek significance, Claire walked back into Nikki's office with a piece of paper she had written for herself: 3 criteria for accepting the Restless consecutive weeks without a boundary breach from Kyle met. A mentorship circle staffed by people who were not all Newmans. Nikki grinned and produced 2 names that made Claire's chest loosen. And a personal deliverable. One project designed by Claire from blueprint to outcome that would not leverage her last name or her connection to anyone else. A pilot to serve survivors of manipulation and coercion who needed job placements with real wages rather than trauma group brochures. Nikki didn't just say yes, said, "Tell me the number, you need to do it right." And Claire, who had learned the difference between being indulged and being empowered, asked for less than Nikki would have thrown at a splashy gala, but more than enough to build something that could stand when the gossip cycle rotated to a new meal. She accepted the role with a start date in 2 weeks and walked out not with a crown, but with a calendar. And the city adjusted its story accordingly. The night after Claire accepted, Kyle took his final extreme step: not performative, not punitive, asked to meet with Audra in a glass-walled conference room at noon with Amanda present. And he said the thing that closes loops: I don't hate you, but I will not carry the version of me that says yes to shadows. And there is no version of us that lives in daylight that doesn't harm someone I refuse to harm. We will be colleagues when the work requires it, and we will otherwise be strangers. And he stood, shook Amanda's hand, nodded to Audra with the courtesy that tells the room the war is over, and left. Claire didn't need the transcript because the gesture's residue traveled faster than any memoirs that used to curve open for gossip stayed shut. And the building learned the new choreography: fewer corners, more windows. In the small apartment that had become their laboratory for learning each other without the noise of heritage. Kyle set the ring box on the table, but didn't open it. He told Claire it would live there like a lighthouse in fog, a point, not a pressure, and she, who had always feared that symbols would own her if she touched them too soon, reached for his hand instead. And they planned a future that had fewer declarations and more rooms they would build one at a time. Amanda's mission, as it turned out, was not merely to investigate and insulate, but to bend the arc. She received a message after our anonymous, clipped, almost bored containing of phone video from the park that showed the slap, the shove, the moment shame and fury braided together. And for a full minute she considered the calculus, deploy it as leverage to force Diane into a public reckoning, suppress it to protect Claire from having her worst humiliation chewed into content, or do something rarer in this tauntale, the truth to the only people who needed to hear it and starve the rumor of oxygen. She called Jack, not Nikki, because the house needed to fix the thing the house broke, and when he arrived she played the minute ones, stopped, and said, "You can keep this from becoming meat. You will do it by changing behavior, not by paying hush money. If it surfaces, we meet it with a statement that does not gaslight. We name the act. We name the amends. And we do not turn Claire into the plot device for Abbott guilt." And Jacko's best self wakes when someone hands him a hard assignment with moral edge promised he would hold that line. Then did the simplest, hardest thing. He went home and told Diane he loved her and that love would now look like silence, space, and the long apprenticeship of humility. By the time Claire's first day in the new role arrived, the city was telling a different story than the one it had rehearsed for months. It wasn't a fairy tale, because those require memory loss to function, and no one here had forgotten anything, but it was a story with ballast, a grandmother who offered power and blessed delay, a mother who would learn to love by decentering herself, a lawyer who built railings where cliffs used to beckon, a man who turned his apology into architecture, and a woman who chose to become worthy on her own terms. There were still sharp edge-stucker's footprints in someone's email header, a rival's curiosity about Amanda's new protocols, a rumor that the video existed and could be traded if the price came wrapped in humiliation, but there was also a map. And when Kyle met Claire outside the elevator that evening, with takeout and tired eyes and a silence that didn't need filling, the ring box still sat on their table, neither talisman nor trap, waiting for the day when not yet would naturally turn into now, not because the city demanded spectacle, but because two people had done the quiet math, met the numbers, and found themselves still standing on the same side of the room. Kyle had never been good at silence, not the kind that drifts between two people like a low fog and turns every simple sentence into an examination. And it showed in the way he held himself across from Claire when she finally said what had been sitting behind her eyes for days, that the worst part wasn't the mistake itself, but the waiting, the way the truth had arrived late and already damaged, the way she had found out there were hours she could not account for because he had chosen to keep them unspoken. He didn't try to argue with her perception or tidy it into something more palatable. He just told the story cleanly this time, not like an alibi, but like a ledger. Owning the kiss with Audra, he had stopped before it bled into catastrophe, naming the moment he knew he'd crossed a line, naming the reason he'd hesitated to say it out loud, fair not of Claire's anger, which he believed he deserved, but of what the confession would confirm about him, about the version of Kyle Abbott who could be reckless when he was lonely and proud when he was cornered. And there in that small space he said the quiet part, that love was not enough if it was asked to carry secrets, that he would not ask her to forget and would not pretend forgetting could ever be the path back. Claire listened without interrupting, not because she'd been convinced, but because she had decided that if there was to be any future at all, it would begin with the full sentence, not the clipped version. And when he finished, she told him the truth that mattered most to her, that the delay had cost something real, that trust had a clock and he'd let it run too long, that a ring could not close a gap that had been opened by silence. He saw the glance at the box on the table and heard the rumor mill chewing on a possible proposal, but he didn't reach for it, not because he had changed his mind, but because the gesture he was about to make had to land as something other than theater. The extreme measure he took was not a stunt, it was a blueprint. He stepped back from the scaffolding of habits that had made the error easy. He pulled himself from every initiative that kept him in Audra's orbit. He filed conflict screens. He invited a third party to audit his communications with her. And because consequences that only live on paper calcify into moved out of the Abbott house without making a speech about exile. Choosing a small neutral apartment where the noise of heritage could not camouflage the work he needed to do, he told Claire where he was. He did not ask her to move in. He did not invite pity. He just created a condition in which his apology had a chance to become measurable rather than mystical. Claire heard the architecture before she felt any relief. She did not mistake scaffolding for healing. She did not reach for the ring nor shove it back across the table. She told him she needed time to watch the new structure hold and, if it did, to climb it slowly until the view changed on its own. Kyle nodded, not as capitulation, but as agreement to the only terms that made sense in a world where words are cheap and patterns are currency. The city noticed the shift because the city is trained to notice movement, and in the space where gossip glossed the edges of their story, a separate rhythm was establishing itself. An elevator opened at Newman and Amanda Sinclair Mitchell Morgan stepped out as if she'd never been gone. A measured precision in her stride and a portfolio under her arm that announced purpose louder than any press release. Whispers had preceded Herfon's, predicting a return. Old allies wondering whether her reemergence would be litigation or counsel, and the answer arrived quickly when she bypassed the glass conference rooms and slipped into a closed-door meeting with Cain Ashby Daniel Goddard, who had requested her not as an ornament for his next maneuver, but as a compass. Cain's reputation in Genoa City has always been a paradox of charm and smoke, a man whose best intentions have often been smuggled inside risky packaging, and he didn't pretend otherwise as he slid a file across the table. A cross-border tangle of licensing rights, a boutique fashion tech patent with unclear provenance, and a trail of shell entities that felt less like a labyrinth and more like a test. He told Amanda he needed clarity because clarity was the only thing that could keep this from detonating into a public fight inside Chancellor Winter's already sensitive corridors. And then more quietly admitted he needed insulation from a force he understood less and less. Phyllis Summers Michelle Stafford, whose entrepreneurial hurricane had a way of turning business into weather. Amanda's mouth twitched into something not quite a smile because she understood the Phyllis factor better than most, and she made her terms clarno-selective truth. No, we're almost their spin, no back channel pressure. If Cain wanted her, he wanted the whole instrument, hard questions, unromantic risk math, and a willingness to walk if the floor started to tilt. He agreed, perhaps because he had learned the expensive way that charisma makes bad collateral, perhaps because he needed someone in the room who would call the storm a storm before it broke glass. And when they shook hands, the city recalibrated. Amanda was back, not to relitigate old griefs, but to do what she had always done better than almost anyone: make the lines bright in rooms that prefer shadows. Phyllis, of course, did not wait to be summoned into the narrative. She found Amanda at Crimson Lights with the kind of smile that telegraphs both warmth and wariness, said she'd heard, said she was happy, said she wanted to avoid any misunderstandings, and then began to sculpt the conversation the way she sculpts all conversations, downplaying the velocity of her latest venture, upplaying the good faith, floating a future in which collaboration would be obvious, inevitable, perhaps even charitable to those who could keep up. Amanda did not bristle. She did not counterpunch. She simply sat in the silence after each proposition until the air around it thinned and the suggestion returned to its actual size. Then she asked for disclosures, for cap tables, for the timeline of Phyllis's rumored overture to a European seed group with a history of asset-stripping distressed brands. And the smile became narrower, not because Phyllis had been caught in a lie, but because she had been asked to treat a conversation as a deposition without a court reporter. The scene ended with two women who know the other's brilliance too well to underestimate it, and a city full of onlookers who understood that any storm involving Phyllis must be described in plural, weather systems, intersecting, capable of jumping tracks without notice. Meanwhile, Billy Abbott Jason Thompson did something he has done less often as he's matured, but still often enough to be predictable. He walked into Jack Abbott's Peter Bergman office and shut the door not to dangle chaos, but to deliver intel. A brother's instinct wrapped in a businessman's concern, he laid out what he had a pattern of hush-hush meetings in back rooms Cain had no real reason to enter if the play was clean. A series of friendly inquiries into Marchetti-adjacent IP that felt like casing to anyone who'd lived through Tucker's last tour. A rumor that the same shelf company Amanda had already circled on her whiteboard had flirted with Audra Charles in the language of strategy calls that tend to end in non-disclosure rather than plants, and he admitted what he didn't have, proof of intent, a straight line from curiosity to conspiracy. The missing name that would make the picture snap into focus. He told Jack he was not interested in preemptive war, he was interested in being awake. And he wanted his brother to understand that Cain might be operating in a zone where even his allies could not tell whether he was building a bridge or a trap. Jack listened with the face he reserves for conversations that mix family and fallout, the one that says he is counting costs and futures at the same time. And he surprised Billy by not defaulting to suspicion. He asked Billy to keep eyes open without sharpening knives, to give Amanda's process room to work, and to remember that every time the Abbotts have decided to fight a shadow, they have ended up punching a mirror. Billy agreed, then did the thing he always does to keep himself from spinning out. Went for a run. He called his kids, and he wrote the fragments of a plan he could shelve if the storm veered or deploy if the barometer kept dropping. Back in the quieter orbit where hearts are recalibrated, Kyle pursued the version of extremity that does not burn bridges for spectacle, but builds smaller ones on repeat. He started therapy alone and did not announce it. He released to junior staffers from the gravitational pull of his mess by arranging lateral moves that would protect their resumes from any splash. He let Claire set the cadence of their contact, and he honored it, resisting the temptation to over-communicate as a kind of penance that would only make her do emotional labor for him. And he made a decision about the ring that was as simple as it was radical. He would ask her when asking did not sound like a solution. He rehearsed it once in his head. The speech that says, "I love you, and I want to build a life that is slower than our fear." And then he put it away, because love has its own schedule and fear is a terrible project manager. Still, because Genoa City runs on theater, whether one wants it to or not. The rumor of an imminent proposal metastasized into predictions and poll questions. Nikki Newman heard them and did what a matriarch should. She redirected the narrative by giving Claire something else to be measured by. Not the shine on the ring, but the shape of a role. She invited Claire to a conversation in which promotion was a possibility rather than a decree, framed not as a rescue package, but as recognition plus responsibility. And when Claire asked for time, Nikki didn't press. She pivoted to mentorships and metrics and the permission structure for a young executive to say not yet without being read as ungrateful or uncertain. And the people who understand institutions understood what had just happened. Nikki had robbed the gossip of oxygen by providing a better story, one in which a woman's value is not a subplot to a man's apology. And yet, because on this show clean new beginnings are always buffered by complications, the Cain-Amanda-Phyllis triangle did not settle into lines so easily drawn. Cain, despite his earnestness with Amanda, made a choice that would read to some as prudent and to others as duplicity. Kept a conversation on the calendar with a third party whose title was deliberately vague and whose friendship with Phyllis had been both boon and balm in the past. Amanda clocked it not because she was surveilling him, but because a favor she'd called in at the Secretary of State's office pinged her email with a corporate officer update that made the hair on her arms lift. She didn't call him out in public, She didn't brief Jack. She asked for a second meeting and put the new name on the table without adjectives. Cain did not contest the facts. He explained the context, that he needed to know whether Phyllis's latest pitch trucked in the same appetite for creative destruction that had nearly swallowed to company's whole the last time she convinced a room that chaos was a growth strategy, and that the best way to know was not to read a deck in a sanitized room, but to feel the temperature around her when the people she hadn't charmed yet asked impolite questions. Amanda didn't reward the candor with a free pass. She asked for boundaries. She wrote them down, and she told him the price if he crossed them or exit, immediate, without compromise. He agreed, for now, and in the space after for now, the city heard the echo of Billy's caution. The storm seldom announces itself as thunder until it is overhead. As Friday, August 29th approached and viewers sharpened their attention for the beat that the young and the restless likes to land before a weekend confession, the reveal, the offer that could be a wedge or a vote. Kyle did the only dramatic thing that wasn't melodrama. He asked Claire to meet him at the greenhouse behind the Abbott estate, a place where his childhood still glowed at the edges and where the walls made of glass would force him to say things he could not hide. He did not kneel. He did not reach for the ring. He offered her a contract of a different kind, 6 promises he would keep regardless of whether she accepted him today. In 6 months, or never, he promised to keep the conflict screens in place not as a probation, but as a practice, to let her schedule determine their rhythm until trust felt like habit again, to redact his family from decisions that only the two of them could own, to build a new Sunday that belonged to them and to no one else, to use therapy as a tool rather than a performance, and to accept that no was not an ending, but a form of leadership when said with love. She read it and felt the strange warmth that comes when a wound is acknowledged without being pressed. And she did not say yes or no. She said keep going, and in the world they live in that is sometimes the most radical answer available. He put the paper on the potting bench, left the box unopened, walked her home without trying to fill the spaces with promises, and realized quickly, grateful that the extremity he'd chosen was not about spectacle at all. It was about building a life whose shape did not depend on audience applause. Elsewhere, as the episodes are clicked toward its last act, Billy slid back into Jack's office with a small update that was neither smoking gun nor false alarm. An overheard fragment at Society about a trial balloon Cain had floated with a European contact who seemed oddly conversant in Marchetti's non-public roadmap. An eyebrow-raising compliment paid to Phyllis by someone who rarely pays compliments without an invoice attached, and a sense that whatever was coming would arrive in overlapping waves rather than a single headline. Jack thanked him and, in a move that showed how far he'd come from the days when every problem looked like a duel, sent a text to Amanda offering data access from the Jabbit side if her inquiry reached a point where defensive collaboration could keep multiple companies from slipping on the same patch of oil. Amanda replied with a single word noted and drafted to memos. One to Cain with the boundary recited back to him like a mirror, and one to herself with the 3 exit conditions under which she would walk to preserve the integrity she had brought back to this town. Phyllis, to no one's surprise, fired off an invitation to coffee to an influencer with a penchant for narrating the city's business feuds as if they were runway shows. And somewhere in the quiet, after hours, Audra's name crossed a calendar line in a way that would tempt an old version of Kyle to text and a new version of Kyle to turn his phone face down and go to sleep. By the time the credits rolled on that Friday, nothing had exploded and yet everything had shifted. Claire had not been hypnotized by a diamond and would not be. Not because she is immune to romance, but because she understands that trust is the only jewelry that doesn't depreciate. Kyle had not chosen a grand gesture over a good decision and would continue not to. Amanda had returned not to haunt, but to heal, albeit with the lucidity that healing sometimes demands hard exits. Cain had found in her not a rubber stamp, but a conscience with a spine. Phyllis had, as ever, moved 3 steps forward and 2 sideways, a dance that keeps adversaries guessing and allies on their toes, Billy had opened his mouth in the service of prudence rather than adrenaline. Jack had chosen coordination over crusade, and Genoa City, ever the amphitheater, had been given the one thing that soap audiences rarely get and appreciate deeply when it arrives: the sense that the adults in the room might actually be doing adult things. Even as the storm builds at the edge of the frame, whether the storm will break over Cain, over Phyllis, over the fragile scaffolding Claire and Kyle are building, or over a piece of intellectual property that has quietly become the hottest unregistered asset in town, remains, as always, the part that keeps everyone watching, arguing, and secretly rooting for the people who have finally learned that saying "not yet" is sometimes the most romantic line a show like this can write.